All right. Welcome, everybody, to another in the Clinton School of Public Service Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Nikolai DiPippa. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships here at the school. And we're here for another, as a lot of us are, timely discussion. Zack and Laura were going to try to join us in April when, like everything, it got pushed and everyone said, we'll just postpone it. And I think we got the good end of that bargain a week before the election. So we appreciate Zack and Laura, you guys taking time. Obviously a lot going on in your field, so we really do appreciate you taking time to do this. So first I wanted you two to kind of go through what led you to the Alliance and kind of some of your background working in this sector.
Great, well, thanks so much, Nikolai, for hosting, and it's really a pleasure to be with you. Sorry that we couldn't be there in person, but yeah, I think the timing is rather fortuitous. I'm going to apologize in advance because I live on Capitol Hill in DC, and we are a field of helicopters right now. And so if you hear them buzzing overhead, I apologize. But in terms of what led me to the Alliance, so a couple of things. So I have a background in national security and foreign policy. Spent much of my early career as a career civil servant at the State Department, and then at the National Security Council at the White House, working on a wide range of issues. I really started working, I think, on many of the issues we're going to talk about today while I was at the National Security Council in 2014, dealing with trying to understand and develop appropriate policy responses to Russia's incursion into Ukraine. Where we really saw, the culmination at that point of a range of tactics that Russia had been testing out for quite some time, using, non-military asymmetric tools to attack democracy. And from there, I left government in 2015. I was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor on the 2016 election, where I, of course, got another upfront seat to seeing how Russia in particular was using these tools and tactics, information operations, cyber attacks, financial tools, et cetera, to undermine and interfere in our democracy. And came out of that election, as a national security professional who feels very committed to addressing attacks on the country, to feel that we as a national security community really didn't have the tools at our disposal to either understand adequately these kinds of attacks on our democracy or to respond. And so started the Alliance for Security and Democracy in early 2017, believed at the time and still do that attacks on our democracy cannot be a partisan issue. And so founded it as a bipartisan organization, co-directed initially with a colleague, Jamie Fly, who used to work for Senator Marco Rubio, and now with Zack, really bringing together people from across different areas of expertise, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, or whether it's on disinformation, cyber attacks, financial influence, emerging technology, et cetera, to look at these problems in a holistic way. And to really understand democracy and attacks on it as a national security issue.
Yeah, and I mean, just as Laura is saying, I think the bipartisan nature of this challenge is something that we really both believe in. So I came out of the Bush administration. I worked there in the Pentagon and in the White House. And, at the time, that was now 15 years ago, things were fairly different. We weren't nearly as concerned as we are now about foreign influence and foreign interference challenges. But what I spent a lot of my time focusing on was China and the military challenges we were seeing from China. And it became clear over maybe the last decade that, in fact, many of the challenges we were facing from China weren't so much the military challenges directly. They were undermining some of our allies and partners economically, or interfering in elections, not necessarily in the United States, but certainly in Taiwan, and recently we've seen in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And so one of the real challenges that I started to see was the fact that we need to have a strategy that's just as concerted in these other areas as the one we're having on the military side, right? So I think the work that Laura and Jamie and others have been doing in this area is just so critical. And so then Jamie Fly, who Laura mentioned, went over to be president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And that gave me an opportunity to work with Laura. And one thing that's kind of nice is I also have a position at the American Enterprise Institute. So, I try and cross a little bit both the world where we're very focused day to day on, election interference, which is so much of what I do with Laura, and then a little bit more of the conservative foreign policy world at AEI.
That's great. Thank you. And I kind of wanted to start maybe at the beginning or somewhat at the beginning. And so the kind of history and maybe concern, obviously, that some of our founding fathers had with foreign interference, but this isn't new. This is something that we've kind of tried to battle since our founding.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Actually, several of the Federalist Papers, most notably Federalist Paper number 68, written by Alexander Hamilton, talks very specifically about the threat of foreign interference in America's nascent democracy at that time, and just how corrosive it would be to the fundamental principles of self-governance and to democracy itself. And it's certainly something that was an animating feature throughout our history, in particular during the Cold War, when there was a lot of concern about what was generally referred to then as Soviet active measures, but broad scale concerns about the way that the Soviet Union sought to influence covertly American politics, sought to exploit issues of racism in America, sought to foment division, sought to seed conspiratorial narratives, like the CIA being behind HIV/AIDS, right? So these are threads that have been here for quite some time. I think a few things happened, at the end of the Cold War. One is that, America stopped fighting the Cold War, and we sought to reprioritize our national security strategy for a world in which democracy was ascendant, and where we didn't believe that we needed to be fighting many of these same battles. Russia, had a blip of time where you could say it maybe pivoted away from some of that kind of activity, but Vladimir Putin, career, KGB officer, who believes that one of the greatest travesties in history was the fall of the Soviet Union, has really brought back with gusto many of those tactics. And in fact, much of the work that we do looks at the way that the emerging technology and shifts in the way we receive information, the way news media is transmitted, the battlefield itself has changed, right? Digital and cyber tools weren't available during the Cold War as a battle surface. And now it's sort of the front lines. And so we've definitely seen a real evolution in how these tactics manifest. But as you said, this threat is very much one that's been on the minds of American leaders for our entire history.
And just to build on what Laura was saying, the very first and sort of probably most well-known piece of work that the Alliance for Securing Democracy has done, something called Hamilton 68. And that's not random, right? It goes back to exactly what you and Laura were saying at the top. And now, you can Google and find our website and look at Hamilton 2.0, which is where we track a lot of this activity. And it's basically in real time from Russia, from China, and from Iran. But I think, as you're saying, Nikolai, it's critical as we think about this as a democracy to go back to our founding principles, because sometimes it's really easy to get pulled away from them. I'm often reminded of how simple it is to sort of say, oh, well, we should act in a reciprocal manner, right? We should just do to China and Russia and Iran what they do to us. But that's not the right answer, right? We have some core principles, and adhering to those principles is actually what's made us so successful. And I think that's something that's important. Certainly, to me, I think to Laura, but more broadly, to our democracy, is making sure that even as we fight back against these efforts to interfere in our democracy, that we do so in democracy enhancing ways.
So we mentioned I guess you can call them the big three, China, Iran, and Russia being the main players in this. And depending on who you talk to, depends on who's the biggest threat. But what are they doing, and kind of the different outcomes that they're maybe trying to achieve as well?
happy to kick off and let Zack clean up where I missed things. So I think that it is important, as you know, to understand the differences amongst these actors. Russia, I think, remains, in our assessment, the most significant threat from a foreign interference perspective, in particular with respect to elections and democratic processes and democratic institutions around elections. Chris Wray, the FBI director, testified to Congress about 6 weeks ago, I think now. COVID time, I lose perspective. I think it was about 6 weeks ago, that Russia is very active in trying to interfere in our election. And in fact, we've already seen the Treasury Department designate 4 individuals linked with Russia for activities to interfere in the 2020 election. Those included 3 individuals who were linked to what I call the artist formerly known as the Internet Research Agency. The Internet Research Agency is, of course, what's usually shorthanded as the St. Petersburg Troll Farm, ran a lot of the social media operations targeting Americans in and around the 2016 election. And the 3 individuals that were designated by the Treasury Department recently were engaged in cryptocurrency operations, trying to fund ongoing efforts by the successor to the Internet Research Agency. The other was an individual named Andriy Derkach, who is a Ukrainian parliamentarian who was named actually in the Treasury designation as a Russian agent. He has been engaged in a variety of efforts to launder information that he believes would be disparaging to Vice President Biden through proxies in the United States. And we can come back to this as a tactic, but this use of Americans is a particularly insidious aspect of these kinds of operations. So that's what we're seeing from Russia. I would note, I guess, 2 other more recent developments there. One is that we know that that the DNI and FBI last week, revealed that Russia had obtained some voter data and was attempting to use that for influence purposes. Now, I want to be clear on this. Obtained voter data doesn't necessarily mean hacked anything or stole voter data. And in fact, the FBI and DHS have been very clear that they have no evidence that any data related to voting or elections has been manipulated or that there's a lack of integrity there. A lot of voting information is public or can be publicly procured. And so it's not at all clear that what Russia obtained there is anything other than obtaining publicly available materials and then seeking to use that for influence purposes. The other thing we know from a bulletin released by the FBI and DHS is that Russian hackers have gained access to some state and local government networks. Again, in this case, there is no evidence that they have manipulated any election-related data. But concerningly, we do know from the FBI and DHS that in a couple of cases, these hackers were actually able to penetrate these state and local government networks and exfiltrate some data. So actually steal some data. We don't know what data. The reason that this is particularly concerning is not necessarily because it could have an impact on the election and voting processes itself. From what we've seen so far, nothing that these hackers appear to have gained access to would actually touch on voting systems or voting processes, but I would call them voting adjacent. And what that means is that, in some cases, you do have data related to elections that is stored in part on networks that aren't voting networks, right? So, for instance, for states that have motor voter registration, the DMV would hold some voter related data, right? So you have a lot of voter adjacent systems. And the second is that, the state and local, networks are often used for reporting results of the election. So election night, websites will be posting ballot counts and things like that. And if hackers have obtained access that would allow them to deface websites, as a New York Times report on this revelation suggests, that could allow them to actually try to create chaos or doubt about the integrity of the election by manipulating the presentation of that numbers. To be clear, it's not actually manipulating the vote count itself, but the public presentation of them could be manipulated. And by the way, Russia did this in a Ukrainian election several years ago. The goal here, and this is what I'm most worried about with this sort of state hack that we know about, is what is often called perception hacking. The idea that in the aftermath of the election, particularly if it's close or contested or delayed, that a foreign actor, and it looks like, you know, Russia's sort of laying the groundwork here as they did in 2016, would reveal evidence, quote unquote evidence, of a hack or some sort of manipulation of data, even if it hasn't happened, in order to sow chaos, in order to make people doubt the legitimacy of the election. And elections are a system based on trust. And so if you're able to undermine people's faith in the process, that can have really devastating results. And we'll come back to that hopefully later in the conversation. I've spoken a lot about Russia, so I'm going to hand it off to Zack to talk about Iran and China.
Yeah, in some ways, you know, there are a lot of similarities between what we saw last week, certainly with the Iranians, and what Laura's talking about with Russia. So just last week, right, we had the first clear case of Iran attempting to interfere in the election. You know, I think there's a lot of lack of clarity about exactly what the Iranians have claimed they were able to do. So one thing that was claimed was that Iran had actually been able to hack into election rolls. And there was a video, in fact, showing some of this data. Of course, now some folks have delved into that data, and it doesn't actually look like the Iranians were able to get into voter rolls. It looks like they hacked other user data, which was then manipulated to look as if it was perhaps hacked from voter rolls. So again, going right back to what Laura was just saying, you know, this is more about perception hacking necessarily than it is about hacking the actual election. And I think this is one thing that we're seeing in common, certainly from Russia and now Iran, but potentially this effort to try and just undermine the belief that this election is going to result in outcomes that are determined by the American people, right? Or determined fairly by the American people. And I think that's often one of the things that we've seen foreign interference trying to do. Sometimes, yes, it is trying to favor one candidate over another, but other times it's just trying to create confusion and sow doubt about the results and thereby undermine democracy in general. And those are, you know, they're two separate objectives, but they're both critical for us to watch out for. And it's part of why we have to avoid overreacting to all of these kinds of stories. And, you know, Laura and I, we talk all the time about foreign interference in elections, but at the end of the day, most people, when you go to the polls, are going to be incredibly confident, I think, that, you know, you put either you mailed in your ballot and you can track it online, and I've done this, right? I can actually see that my ballot was returned, when it was returned, where it was returned to, and that it's going, therefore, to be counted. You're going to go vote in person. You know, have a paper ballot usually, right? So you can be very confident, first, that your vote is counting, but also that this is often an auditable process, right? That even if something happened, we can go back and double check and make sure that we got it right. And obviously, you know, there's a little bit more news last week on the Iran side, right? Where the Iranians reportedly sent out emails trying to possibly persuade people not to go to the polls. You know, there's a lot of debate about exactly what happened in that case, but I think we've seen some great reporting from the US government on this, right? In particular from the Department of Homeland Security and from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they are the go-to sources for good information. They are tracking this work. And, you know, I think the fact that they're being able to react so quickly and actually say what happened and who did it and get this public information out there is really critical. The last actor, which we haven't talked about yet, is China. You know, China is a different actor in this space. And the way it was characterized in August by the US intelligence community is that China knows that its actions could affect the election, but then the intelligence community didn't say that it was taking actions in an effort to affect the election outcome. And that's quite a big difference, which is not to say that we shouldn't worry about Chinese interference efforts at all, right? I mean, you can look abroad and you see case after case of Chinese interference, not just in elections, but in political processes. But I think right now we don't have the same kind of evidence from China about efforts to interfere directly in this election and change the outcome as we do from Iran and from Russia, where really we've caught them red-handed, and just in the last couple of weeks, and the intelligence community has made that incredibly clear in both of those cases.
Wanted to kind of have a little bit of discussion on the impact of these campaigns, and you'll see some of this. It was a couple Facebook posts from 2016 that didn't change my vote, or it's a couple emails. Obviously that wasn't a real email. So maybe the intended impact or desired impact, and then the actual impact for some of these different techniques that these countries use.
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest questions to answer, in part because I think, when you're sort of measuring impact, you need to understand, what the denominator is. I don't think we often have a shared understanding or a clear sense of what, in fact, we're talking about impact on. And talking about impact on voting behavior is one piece of that, right? But I would argue that that's only one piece of it. As we just discussed about certainly Russia and Iran, part of the goal isn't necessarily to influence just how a person votes, but it's also to influence or sort of upend their faith in the entire system, right? And the integrity thereof. And so that makes the challenge somewhat significant in that sense, number one. Number two, let's take the Iranian emails, for instance, right? As you suggest, just a few emails, right? We could say that's absolutely the case. But before the DNI and FBI came out last week and announced that they had assessed that Iran was behind those emails, cable news was plastered with reports of these emails supposedly from a white supremacist group being sent to intimidate voters. And so you can't necessarily just measure, even for your numerator, how many emails went out. Rather, it's the broader sort of coverage of this, right? If we go back to 2016, you could talk about the WikiLeaks reports, right? And the hack and leak that was targeted at both the DNC and at certain campaign aides of Hillary Clinton's, including her chair, John Podesta. But it wasn't necessarily the sort of tweets from WikiLeaks themselves, right? But the sort of wall-to-wall coverage of those emails without context of the fact that they had been hacked by Russia to affect the election by mainstream newspapers across the board, right? So I think it's really, really challenging to answer that specific question. What I would say is, number one, we do know that certainly in the case of Russia, and it appears in the case of Iran, that one of its goals is really to make us lose faith in the process, right? And if we go back to the intelligence community assessment from January of 2017 about Russia's efforts then, as well as subsequent bipartisan reports from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which of course one of your own senators sits on, it's clear that Russia had three goals, one of which was to undermine faith in democratic institutions, one of which was to hurt Hillary Clinton, and one of which was to help Donald Trump. But so you have to talk about impacts sort of across multiple different dimensions. I think the reality is that, we as a country right now are very divided. And sometimes you can say that a lot of what foreign actors may be doing might pale in comparison to some of the domestic activity that we see to sow doubt on the integrity of elections, to, divide, around polarizing issues. But I think it's very important to understand that those two aren't separate, that our domestic vulnerabilities are exploited by foreign actors, and that our domestic vulnerabilities also create a riper target surface for them. And so from that perspective too, I think that it's really important that Americans understand that, frankly, maintaining faith in these institutions and doing what we can to bolster them is one of the most important antidotes to this kind of activity that we're seeing, less necessarily even about pushing back directly on these foreign actors.
I would just add, some of these theories and conspiracy theories seem pretty crazy, right? I mean, Laura earlier mentioned, the idea that the CIA developed HIV/AIDS, which, plagued the United States, right, among other countries, to undermine Africa as a competitive strategy to keep an edge, right? Like this was a Soviet effort to undermine the United States. Now you could say that seems pretty crazy, right? But if you go search the internet, you'll find something like 6 million hits last time I looked for CIA AIDS Africa. And keep in mind, those aren't hits from when the story happened in 1980 because the internet wasn't around then, right? These are stories written more recently. So yeah, many of those blogs, stories, posts, whatever they are, may be saying, oh, this was an example of Russian disinformation. But actually, if you look at polling data, the percentage of people that think that the CIA created AIDS and HIV is actually substantially higher than you would think, right? You'd think it would be pretty close to zero. It's not, right? And those rumors have spread. And, you know, you can go look back in history and you find cases in India where actually this story gets a lot of traction during some of the discussions about the non-aligned movement, right? And so even though we don't know impact, we do know that these kinds of stories do have an effect. Now, there's another side of this too, right? Which is to say, sometimes these kinds of interference and disinformation efforts backfire. And if you don't know what you're doing, they backfire pretty quickly. So the case I have spent the most time looking at recently is the China case, where actually China has stepped up its information campaigns, its disinformation campaigns over the last year and a half. And what do you see? You see over the last year and a half that public views, not just in the US, but around the world of China, have gone down the drain. So something like 70 to 80% of publics in most of Europe now, if you ask whether they see China as a competitor or as a cooperative partner, they now say competitor. That's an increase in many of these countries of 20 to 30%. These are really substantial changes. And that's in part because, you know, China hasn't been quite as artful as the Russians have, frankly, in managing this information and disinformation set of campaigns. So there's a double-sided coin. You know, it can be pretty effective, especially on the margins, but if it's not done carefully, the blowback can be real.
The security of U.S. election infrastructure, it's something that it's brought up, and anytime there's a story like this, that and Laura, you even mentioned, like, no votes were changed. And it's something that really want to reiterate, but I also think kind of seeing it over the past, 6-7 years with that line, that it also glosses over you to think, okay, well, this isn't a big deal. And so one is going to talk about in general, what's changed in the kind of infrastructure from 16 to 20. And whether or not that phrase, no votes were changed, maybe is stopping people's attention of what's actually happening.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. One, this is where there actually really is a good news story over the past 4 years. 4 years ago, before the 2016 election, election infrastructure, because in the United States, state and local governments, states really, and then in some cases sort of devolved to local governments, run elections. And the federal government has a very limited role in that. Unfortunately, we never really thought in advance of that election about the ways that could leave us vulnerable. And where we had basically like municipal officials on the front lines battling Russian military intelligence hackers, which is sort of not exactly the matchup you want. And so, at the end of the Obama administration, election infrastructure was designated critical infrastructure, which enabled a whole host of different support systems to be brought in and additional capabilities brought to bear to protect those networks. There's been a lot of like really boring sounding, but incredibly important technocratic stuff that's happened over the past 4 years. So it took a really long time after the 2016 election to be able to tell which networks may or may not have been accessed and what happened, like even in retrospect, because they just weren't networks where the US government and its network defenders had access and visibility. In the time since, we now have in every single state these things called Albert sensors that have been installed on state and local election networks that enable real-time detection of any sorts of anomalous behavior and very rapid incident response and remediation efforts, which is absolutely critical in these kinds of instances, right? So that's one. Two, there's connections between state and local officials and federal officials in ways that there weren't before. There's been information sharing mechanisms that have been created. They have more security clearances that have been given now at state and local levels, state levels mostly, so that officials can actually know what the threats are that they're trying to defend against. So, and then we've seen upgrades of the actual infrastructure itself, right? So estimates differ a little bit, but there's agreement that more than 90% of voters this year will cast ballots that have a paper record, which is incredibly important for the auditability that Zack was talking about earlier, right? To be able to go back and have that record that even if something were to go wrong, even if it's just like a power outage, right? That you know that you have that paper record to be able to go back and check. And hopefully we can soon be on the way to making that, 100% in the United States with some additional funding. So, election infrastructure is, I think, much more secure than it was 4 years ago. That doesn't mean it's not being targeted, right? Chris Krebs, the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has made clear that, they see scanning of these networks, they see attempted probes on these networks, and it's not just, by the way, foreign actors, right? Cyber criminals try and do this too. But so far there's no evidence that anybody's been able to be successful. So that's sort of on that first point. I think that's really important to emphasize, in part because if the goal of these actors is to make us lose faith in the integrity of the process, it's really important that Americans know that the process has integrity, right? To sort of make a tautological statement. But I think that is really important. Now, your second point, though, is equally important, right? By emphasizing no votes for change, does that somehow downplay things? And I think that's where it actually comes back to the conversation we were having earlier about impact, right? And if impact is simply seen as changing votes, then I think it does sort of miss the point, right? And we need to reaffirm to people that is not the only goal and isn't the only way we should be thinking about these interference operations. One of my colleagues, Jessica Brandt, has a great phrase, which I sort of plagiarize freely from her, which is that for these kinds of interference operations, elections aren't a starting point or an end point, they're a flashpoint. And we need to sort of understand them in that context. And I think that's kind of the way that I frame it out.
And just to build on that last point, I think that means that, when we're thinking about trying to make sure that our elections and our electoral processes are working, actually, we need to think much more broadly than just about ballots, right? And that means that it doesn't just matter whether you vote. Actually, there are other things that we can all do that decrease the vulnerability of not just ourselves, but our broader political system to this kind of interference. So things like just the nature of how we all both gather information and how we all have discussions as a society, right? That's actually really important, because so much of the time what we're seeing is interference efforts are building on cracks in democracies, right? They're going after issues that are really contentious and often really polarizing and partisan. And so to the extent that we can decrease that level of polarization, we actually decrease the amount of opportunity that there is to interfere in the election. And so, yes, there's concerns about obviously the specific voting mechanisms and voting roles and all of that, and that's good and important, and something that I certainly think should get a bit more attention given the amount of money that we spend on our security in general. Like, the basic security of our democratic processes should be a foundational element. But for all of us, just daily thinking through, how do I want to have this debate on a contentious issue, right? Is there a way to do it where you're talking more about the ideas and less about the people right behind it, right? These are also ways that actually make it more difficult for foreign interference to be effective. And so some of this is just about the discourses that we have and how we conduct that discourse. So that's part of why, for me, trying to do this in a bipartisan manner is just absolutely critical, because we have to be able to show that, you know, we can have big disagreements on policy issues and on political issues, but that American people can still speak with one voice when it comes to things that are, you know, core to our democracy, like protecting against foreign interference.
If you want a chilling but sober day, go to the Alliance website and read their briefings and and kind of what they are capturing of what's happening. And that's what I was, you know, spending my weekend doing. And on one of them from October 14th, they talked about a nightmare scenario, and they listed out 3 things that were going to happen. The first is an information operation run through legitimate domestic actors. And that was one of the ways that some of the changes from 16 to 18, that they would find real people to kind of carry their water, if you will, so that they could be further removed from it. The second was a hack and leak, and then combining that with the perception hacking that we kind of touched on. And then the third scenario was this potential for cyber actors to spread false claims of hacked voter information using publicly available information. And so, one, you kind of called this. The Alliance did really good work, and we're kind of discussing what some of these things are happening. On October 14th was also the day that the New York Post ran a story about Hunter Biden's laptop. And then the response to that was whether or not the social media companies should stop it or dethrottle it. And then there was, they did, but then they didn't. And it was as if this was playing out kind of from the almost tabletop that y'all were doing. And so I just kind of want to talk on that of what we've seen. We had it written down of this may happen, and yet it happens, and we still kind of weren't prepared, I guess you will, for some of the things that are going to happen over the closing week.
So I think, thanks also, Nikolai, for highlighting our report. And yeah, the bad news is that when you spend your days like thinking about all the bad things that can happen and the nightmare scenarios that may come, you know, sometimes you end up getting it right. And I do sometimes feel like I'm just like one big ball of like doomsday when I just think about all these things all the time. But I think you're right to point to the fact that, you know, the reason that we do this stuff is in part for preparedness purposes, right? Like we want to game out these scenarios in advance so we can be prepared. And in fact, we did actually run a tabletop exercise that had a very similar scenario of information of unknown provenance, uncertainty if it was hack and leak, uncertainty if it was falsified information or actually true. And the bottom line, I think, of what we've seen in terms of how this has played out in real time is that, in fact, these are really hard questions. And for many of them, there's not clear answers, especially when you do have, you know, Americans themselves involved. And certainly when you have media outlets involved, where you have, you know, real questions related to the First Amendment, where you have real questions related to, you know, the role that private companies have now taken in our lives, you know, unaccountable, unelected private companies have taken in our lives, of shaping our information environment, of taking these kinds of decisions. And of course, for folks who were, you know, following along at home, we saw actually one of those platforms, at least Twitter, sort of make one decision, then change course again. And, you know, I think the reality is that, you know, in some of these instances, you know, we talk about these tactics as being asymmetric because they are, right? Advantage is going to always be to the adversary here. And when we're trying to operate, as Zack, you know, really emphasized earlier, from the position of acting in accord with democratic principles, it's really, really hard to figure out what the right answer is. I do think that it is important when in doubt and when the stakes are very high, to err on the side of caution. When there is potentially, you know, significant disinformation operation underway or concerns about a hack and leak, you know, I think that the caution is absolutely warranted. How that manifests, I think, is you know, up for debate. But it's certainly what we didn't see in 2016, right? When, the New York Times and others ran front page stories on hacked emails without mentioning once that they had been hacked by Russia to affect the election. But, this is where I think we need to have a broader national conversation where we, as a society, need to grapple with what is the democratic information space that we want. How do we want to be, in some control of the information that comes at us, not just algorithms that are built for profit. And so, that's not going to help us in the next 7 days. But I do think it's going to help us in the longer term. The other more tactical thing I would say on the preparedness side is I do think this is where it's really important for the American voters to be prepared. As like crazy as this is seemed, over the past few months, the next week and the weeks after are probably only going to get more crazy and chaotic. And there was a really alarming study that I was just reading this morning that was done by some colleagues who work on these issues out in a partnership being run by Stanford University, gaming out all the different ways that we could have a polluted information environment around the election over the next several weeks. I highly commend it to folks because I think understanding the confusion and chaos that's going to come is actually one of the most important ways that we can all sort of just keep calm. And I know that sounds probably Pollyannish, but I think it's one of the most important things that the American people can do right now is know that things are going to look really messy. And hey, look, American democracy's kind of always been messy. And that doesn't mean that like we shouldn't try to fix things and whatnot, but we don't want to do is allow our own fear and angst to become a self-fulfilling prophecy where that messiness is actually used to undermine democracy itself.
Yeah, and I'll just come back to one thing that Laura said, because I think it's so critical and such a problematic issue, which is, for many of us, right, we get information from social media, right? And as Laura said, we saw Twitter try its very best to manage the New York Post story. And I don't know which version of what they did failed, but I know one of them wasn't right, because they did 2 or 3 different things. And Facebook also, right? Trying to respond incredibly quickly. So you get critiqued in 2016 for not taking action and being too slow. And this time you move really fast. You take remarkable action, much more than I ever would have expected, at least on those timelines from those 2 companies. And what do you get? You get blowback again, right? And so I think, one of the challenges here is if we had perfect information right away on exactly what was going on with these kinds of stories, it would actually be fairly easy to apply the rules that Facebook and Twitter have. Now, the problem, of course, is that number one, there's a lot of wiggle room in these rules for how you're going to take certain material down, under what circumstances. And then there's a secondary problem, which is, this is not happening in a vacuum. You have an opponent or a set of opponents who are reading those rules and trying to think, how are we going to get around this, right? So if it's very clear that you have hack and leak material coming from abroad, okay, that's probably going to get taken off these sites. So then when you have material that looks to have been gathered somehow and leaked by a domestic actor, that's harder to take down, but it also increases your concern if you're a platform that maybe that this is one of the foreign actors trying to game the system, right? And of course, in this case, unlike in the 2016 case, we don't have a ton of forensic data, for example, on the details behind the New York Post story. We have a couple of interviews with the gentleman who provided the laptop, but that's not a lot to go on as like real confirmable data about exactly what's going on here. And that lack of information makes it really hard to make decisions for social media companies. And I think I come out the same place that Laura started, which is at the end of the day, the damage that can be done is mostly from providing information that's false. Having a little bit of a delay in people seeing that information is probably a risk that we as a society should be willing to bear, as long as we are confident then that we're not leading into a world that's highly censored and controlled by companies that aren't responsible to folks. So, I think there are different ways people are thinking about this. Facebook is trying to develop an oversight board, which is quasi-independent, to try and think through some of those challenges. Other companies are discussing other ideas like that. But this is one of the real fundamental problems, which is sometimes you're just not going to have ground truth on a fast moving story. And especially in the next 7 days, if anything quick is coming out, there's a pretty good chance that before the election, we're not going to know exactly what happened with the situation. And it puts a real premium on people to be smart in what they're reading and what they're retweeting and posting, because once the story's out there, you can't take it back. So we've all got to be really careful the next 7 days about what we do. And frankly, as Laura said, not just the next 7 days, but probably in the days and weeks after the election as well.
I'm going to take some questions from the chat, from the audience. Colonel Wright from Office of Senator Cotton had a question about what does Russia and China have to gain by interfering with elections. I think we talked about a little bit of that earlier, kind of the showing doubt on democracy in general. But his third part was, are there other players seeking gain via U.S. election interference that we didn't discuss?
It's a great question. I would say that we've consistently seen these three actors, not only in our own research, but in the intelligence community assessments, as the ones that are of greatest concern. We did at one point see, one intelligence community official name sort of a list of a few other actors where he saw some potential. But I think the reality is that when it comes to the more election-focused kind of activity that we've been talking about, it really is these three. There are absolutely a range of other actors, whether it's a number of Gulf states who engage in these kinds of both information operations as well as cyber attacks or even hack and leak campaigns, in order to advance their own strategic objectives, and in some cases, sort of interfere in and undermine democracy. There's consistently been concerns about North Korea, which in fact, I think a lot of people kind of forget this, but folks may remember the Sony hack in 2014, the hack of Sony Pictures. Kim Jong-un didn't like a movie they had coming, and so they hacked into Sony in a very destructive cyber attack that caused huge amounts of economic loss. And they released the emails publicly, and then on top of that, threatened to blow up movie theaters if they showed the film. And in fact, it was not only a hack and leak operation intended to sort of interfere in and frankly undermine Americans' First Amendment rights, but I'm going to blank on the quote from President Obama at the time, but he basically said, I'm not going to let some dictator sitting in some other country allow to dictate what Americans can and can't do in terms of free expression, right? I'm butchering the quote, but it was essentially along those lines. And so while we don't see a lot of that kind of activity from North Korea, I think there are a number of other actors that are using pieces of this toolkit to their own ends. However, as I said, I don't think that is necessarily really in and around the election in the way we see particularly Russia and Iran engaging.
Yeah, and just a quick point on this, which is, there are lots of countries and individuals that want to influence political processes within the United States, right? I mean, just the last few days, we've seen a couple of European leaders come out and make direct statements, both for Biden and for Trump, about what they want to have happen in the election. But that's a very different kind of challenge, right? For one simple reason, which is that it tends to be overt, right? I mean, these are public statements posted on Twitter. We can all go read them. It's very different to have these kinds of covert challenges that, work through corrupt ways and legal loopholes. And so that is just a much smaller set of potential actors. And, as Laura mentioned, I think, earlier on, it had been suggested that we'd seen some amount of activity out of Saudi Arabia and Turkey as well, which, was a little surprising to some people, given that those are, U.S. security partners. But those kinds of behavior, I think, don't rise anything like to the level of what we're seeing from Russia and Iran or even China. So I do think those three are really the ones to pay the most attention to.
And that leads us to Karen Wilbur, who had a question of, is there any evidence of those three, Russia, China, and Iran, working or coordinating their efforts?
Maybe I'll jump in on this one first, because this is something we've been talking a lot about recently. So the bottom line is you could go look on our Hamilton 2.0 dashboard and find a lot of times when those three countries actually go to the same conspiracy theorists and retweet posts that, you know, are highly similar, but we can't then prove that there's been coordination among them, right? So I don't think we have a silver bullet answer to this question, but it's something I'm really interested in, and not so much necessarily even just the coordination, but the learning among all three, right? So I certainly think that we've seen China in the last year pick up strategies that the Russians have practiced elsewhere and start applying them, maybe less in the United States, but certainly in third parties. And I think we're just going to see that continue, right? If you're trying to learn how to do this kind of messaging and disinformation, why not learn from the best? And that's the Russians. They've been doing this the longest. They've got the most experience. And so you kind of be foolish not to learn from them, even if you're not directly asking them, how did you do this? Did it work? Did it not work? You know, we do tons of research on this, and you could just read our stuff about, you know, what have the Russians done and what has worked and what hasn't. And that would give you a learning mechanism. But whether there's actual coordination there, I think is a little bit harder to say. But as I said, we're trying to start up a big project looking at this. So hopefully we'll have answers at some point down the road in 2021.
And then we've got one more from our audience of Laura, you wrote in a foreign affairs piece that the real threat of foreign interference actually comes after Election Day. So how China might do to interfere or influence after election. What threat would that be?
So I actually don't necessarily think I see a significant prospect for China to engage in some of the post-election interference that we were talking about earlier, because I think a lot of that is going to be focused on, you know, really sowing chaos and doubt in the integrity of the election. And that's just not something that we've seen China to date have an intention or motivation to do. You know, I can't 100% rule it out. Obviously, I only know what I can see in the open source. But I'm less concerned about China in sort of those immediate post-election scenarios. I'm mostly concerned about Russia in that scenario and maybe a tiny bit Iran. That's not to say, though, that like the threat of and challenge of, you know, Chinese interference operations won't persist after the election. I mean, I see these as much more ongoing efforts to shape and influence American public discourse, to denigrate democracy and to undermine and weaken it. And so those operations, I think, will certainly persist, but I don't necessarily see them as being the kind of post-election scenarios that I laid out in that foreign affairs piece. But Zack may want to add. No.
Coming in an hour, so I wanted to kind of give you both a little bit of time for closing thoughts.
Well, first of all, I'm just really glad to have had the opportunity to have this conversation. So thank you to Nikolai and the Clinton School of Public Service for hosting us today, even again, if we can't be there in person. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I believe that today is the last day in Arkansas to request a mail-in ballot, an absentee ballot. So if you haven't done that, you should do that. You should also then very promptly get it in. I think that you know, the earlier people can vote, the better off we'll be in terms of some of these you know, post-election concerning scenarios. I think that my most important message to people right now is that These actors that we're talking about today want us to lose faith. They want us to not participate. They want us to doubt. And we have agency here to actually resist that, to participate, to vote, to volunteer, to work the polls, to get others out to vote, right? And you know, in some ways, the greatest statement of faith that people can make in the process is participation and voting itself. You know, I think people need to be ready that we may not know the results election night, right? And it may take a little while. And as I mentioned earlier, that we're going to see messiness. And patience is not something that we Americans practice very well. And I think we're just going to have to really try. And I think some of the points that Zack was raising earlier about, you know, about the need to be careful with information that we consume and share is also really relevant here. I'd also just quickly note, I saw a question in the chat box about, you know, whether or not, you know, we can sort of believe what we're being told in terms of whether there's been manipulation of voting. And I'll just say a couple of things here. One, you know, state and local election officials are, you know, this is their sort of lifeblood. Running elections and doing it with integrity is their business. And I think that they are some of the most trusted sources of information that people can and should be turning to in the days ahead. Number one. Number two, there's a great resource that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has created, which is a website literally called Rumor Control, where they're going to be posting all kinds of information about you know, what they do and don't see happening, and trying to get people information in real time. The third thing is that, look, just to be quite candid, you know, I've been outspoken and concerned about some of what I've seen in terms of politicization of these issues by parts of this administration. But I will tell you that I have enormous faith in the professionals who are running the election defense operations. These are people who have put their own credibility on the line significantly. They have taken risks professionally, and they are dedicated public servants who are working to protect the integrity of American democracy and the integrity of the American vote. And I absolutely trust that they are doing everything they can to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. And I'll just add a couple of thoughts. You know, one is that I think there's a time after this election where we're all going to have a debate, a broader debate, right, about information and the way it's handled and controlled, not just by governments, but by media organizations, by social media platforms. And I think that's a debate that is coming and is necessary, right? And there are really different views on not just the right and the left, but within the left and within the right on this, right? You know, like on the right, for example, Josh Hawley is putting forward some ideas that are really different than most of the ideas from most other Republicans. And so I think there's going to be a big debate, which will be affected certainly by the results of the election, but will be largely separate from it, about how we are going to handle information in general. And that's a debate that I hope people engage in actively, because I think it's just absolutely critical, not just for the election, but more broadly to deal with the polarization challenge that we've had the last couple of years. And then the final thing I would say, just building on Laura's important comments, you know, you should have a huge amount of faith, both in the federal government and the efforts that are being done to try and protect the elections and to surface information about interference in those elections, but also in your state and local officials. And I think this is one of the great things about democracy, right? If you ask people whether they believe in Congress, the answer that comes back is really negative, right? If you ask people whether they believe in their member of Congress, you actually get a lot of support. And I think one of the things to remember is that, as Laura said, you know, voting is done on a state basis, right? And it's those local officials that are handling ballots. And yes, they need help from technology and cybersecurity to try and help them protect their election platforms. But it's those people, the people in your community, who are the ones that are actually counting the votes. And I think that helps people remember that actually there's not some giant system that, you know, you can't understand actually all of us can volunteer and, you know, go be poll workers and help aid in this process. So I think remembering that democracy is local in this case is really important as well. But I want to just second Laura and thank you, Nikolai, so much for hosting us. It's great to get a chance to chat with folks, and I wish we could be there in person, but I'm happy we were able to do this before the election regardless.
Thank you guys both, Zack and Laura, thank you, and we will welcome you back anytime. Unfortunately, I don't think this issue will end regardless of what happens next week, and so we'll for sure have you back to talk about the great work that y'all are doing. Thanks again, and we'll hope to see all of you at the next one. Thanks.
Thanks so much.